The town of Raven's Hollow slumbered under a veil of tradition and silent grudges. Arya Grayson had lived her whole life within its walls, where her every move seemed to echo through the gossipy cobblestone streets. The daughter of Mayor Grayson, she bore the weight of a reputation she had not asked for, a perfect, obedient young woman who upheld the family name. But tonight was different. The air carried a rare crispness, and the moonlight bathed the forest just beyond the town in silvery light. Arya slipped past the gates, her heart pounding with exhilaration. She wasn't supposed to be here, wandering alone in the forbidden woods. Yet, the call of freedom was too strong, the whispers of the forest too tempting. Her dark blue cloak swirled around her as she moved, her lantern casting flickering beams of light. She hummed a soft tune, feeling bolder with each step away from the suffocating gaze of her father's mansion. And then she saw him. Elias Mason was kneeling by the stream, his sleeves rolled up as he rinsed his hands. A lantern rested on the rocks beside him, its golden glow reflecting on the water's surface. Arya froze, her breath hitching. She recognized him at once. Everyone in Raven's Hollow knew the Masons. They were craftsmen, known for their beautiful carvings and outspoken defiance of the mayor's policies. Her father often scoffed at them, dismissing their family as troublemakers. Yet here Elias was, not at all the rugged rebel she had imagined. His auburn hair caught the light as he moved, and his features were softened by concentration. He seemed utterly at ease, unaware of the figure watching him from the shadows. A branch cracked under Arya's foot. Elias turned sharply, his piercing green eyes locking onto hers. For a long moment, neither of them moved. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady but low. Arya hesitated. She could feel her pulse thrumming in her ears. Finally, she stepped forward, her hood slipping back to reveal her face. Elias blinked, clearly taken aback. "Miss Grayson?" His tone held both surprise and suspicion. "I didn't mean to intrude," Arya said quickly, her cheeks flushing. I was just walking." Elias rose to his feet, brushing off his hands on his trousers. "Walking? At this hour? In these woods?" He tilted his head, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Do you always court danger so boldly, Miss Grayson?" Her blush deepened, but she squared her shoulders. "Do you always question strangers so boldly, Mr. Mason?" He chuckled, and the sound was warm, disarming. "Touché." For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the gentle murmur of the stream. Arya found herself studying him, his relaxed posture, the faint scars on his hands, the way his smile seemed to light up his entire face. He didn't seem dangerous at all. On the contrary, he seemed intriguing. "What brings you here?" she asked, breaking the silence. Elias shrugged, leaning against a tree. "The forest doesn't ask questions. It's a good place to think." Arya nodded. "I suppose we have that in common." He raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her admission. "And what does the mayor's daughter have to think about out here?" She hesitated. How could she explain the stifling expectations, the longing for something, anything, beyond the gilded cage of her life? Instead, she offered a half-smile. "I could ask you the same question." "Fair enough," Elias said, his grin widening. "Maybe we're both just looking for something we can't find in town." The way he said it, lightly, but with a hint of truth, made Arya's heart skip. She felt a strange connection to him, a kindred spirit in this unexpected place. As they stood there, exchanging tentative smiles, the night seemed to grow brighter, the stars above twinkling with a secret they shared. Arya felt a warmth she hadn't known she was missing. But then, a voice shattered the moment. "Arya, where are you?" She froze, the blood draining from her face. It was her father's steward, Mr. Haynes, his voice sharp and searching. The sound came closer, accompanied by the rustle of leaves and the crunch of boots on the forest floor. Elias's expression hardened, and he stepped back, retreating into the shadows. "You should go," he whispered urgently. "They can't see us together." Arya hesitated, torn between the sudden ache of leaving and the fear of being caught. The footsteps grew louder, more insistent. "Go," Elias urged again, his eyes flicking toward the direction of the approaching voice. "I'll cover your tracks." She nodded reluctantly, pulling her hood back up. "Thank you," she whispered before hurrying into the darkness. As she ran, her heart pounding, she cast one last glance over her shoulder. Elias was still there, watching her with an unreadable expression before the shadows swallowed him whole. When Arya burst out of the woods and into the clearing, Mr. Haynes was waiting, his lantern held high. His face twisted with disapproval. "Miss Grayson," he snapped, "what were you thinking, wandering out here alone? Your father will hear of this." She ducked her head, murmuring a soft apology. But her thoughts were elsewhere, on the boy by the stream and the way he had looked at her, as though he truly saw her. Little did she know, the choices she had made tonight would set into motion a chain of events that would change her life forever. Behind her, in the forest's shadowy depths, Elias crouched low, his eyes narrowing as he spotted something glinting in the underbrush. It was a silver pin, a Grayson family crest, left behind in her hurried escape. Before he could react, a low growl echoed through the trees, and a dark figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking his path. The quiet of Arya's bedroom was deceptive, a fragile shell containing her spiraling thoughts. She sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection, though her mind lingered in the woods. Elias Mason's face haunted her memory, the way his smile softened his features, the gentle lilt in his voice. It was reckless, absurd even, to think about him. And yet, she couldn't stop. Her father's voice carried through the house below, booming and authoritative. "She knows better than to wander like that, Haynes," he was saying. "I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." Arya bit her lip, dread coiling in her stomach. It wasn't fear of punishment that troubled her. It was the thought of her world growing even smaller. She longed for freedom, and for the first time, that freedom felt tied to a pair of green eyes and a warm laugh. She glanced toward the window. The moon hung high, bathing her room in a pale glow. The pull to return to the woods was irresistible. What if Elias was still there? The risk was enormous. Her father's mansion was guarded, and sneaking out a second time would only fan the flames of suspicion. But the yearning for something more, for someone who saw her not as the mayor's daughter, but as simply Arya, was stronger. Quietly, she slipped on her cloak and opened the window. The cool night air kissed her face as she climbed out, landing softly in the garden below. She moved with practiced ease, her years of evading the watchful eyes of her father's staff serving her well. Elias hadn't gone home. He couldn't. He sat on a fallen log by the stream, the silver Grayson family crest pin glinting in his hand. Its intricate design, a falcon clutching an olive branch, was unmistakable. He turned it over thoughtfully, his mind racing. Aria Grayson was the last person he had expected to meet in the woods. The Graysons and the Masons were locked in a silent war, one that had festered for decades. No one seemed to remember the exact origin of the feud, but it was deeply rooted in power, pride, and betrayal. His family's defiance of the mayor had always been a point of pride for Elias. But now, it felt like a barrier, a chasm between him and the girl who had stolen into his thoughts. The sound of a snapping branch jolted him from his reverie. He rose swiftly, his hand instinctively moving to the small knife he carried. His heart slowed when he saw her stepping into the clearing, her lantern casting a soft glow around her. "Aria," he said, surprised but not displeased. "I shouldn't be here," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But I had to come back. I had to see you." Elias studied her, his expression unreadable. Then he extended his hand, showing her the pin. "I believe this belongs to you." Her eyes widened, and she reached for it. Their fingers brushed briefly, sending a shiver down her spine. "Thank you. I must have dropped it when I left." "You're lucky no one else found it," Elias said quietly. "Do you have any idea what could happen if someone knew you were out here?" "With me?" She nodded, clutching the pin tightly. "I know it's dangerous, but I can't help it." He tilted his head, a small smile playing at his lips. "Can't help what?" "Coming here. Talking to you." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but her words carried weight. For a moment, they simply stood there, the forest alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. The world beyond seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them. Aria felt a strange courage bubbling up inside her, a defiance she hadn't known she possessed. "What about you?" she asked. "Why are you still here?" Elias hesitated, his gaze flickering to the stream. "Because maybe I couldn't help it either." The confession hung between them, electric and raw. Elias met her eyes, and in that moment, the divisions between their families, their worlds, seemed insignificant. The nights that followed were a blur of whispered meetings and stolen glances. They met beneath the moonlight, weaving secrets into the fabric of the forest. Aria told Elias of her suffocating life in the mayor's mansion, of the expectations that weighed her down like iron chains. Elias, in turn, spoke of his family's struggles, the constant battles to keep their workshop running, the resentment that burned like a low flame in the town's underbelly. "You're nothing like I imagined," Aria admitted one night, her fingers trailing over the moss-covered trunk of a tree. "I thought you'd be, I don't know, angry, bitter." Elias chuckled, leaning against a nearby tree. "I thought you'd be entitled and shallow. Funny how wrong we both were." She laughed softly, the sound like music in the stillness. It was moments like these that made Elias forget the risks, forget the looming shadow of their family's feud. But the risks were real. It was late one evening when Elias returned home to find an envelope slipped beneath the door of the Mason family workshop. His name was scrawled across it in jagged handwriting. He hesitated before opening it, his gut twisting with unease. The note was brief, but chilling. Stay away from her, or face the consequences. Elias' jaw clenched as he crumpled the paper in his fist. Who had written it? How had they found out? His mind raced with possibilities, but the answers eluded him. He thought of Arya, her laugh, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of her dreams. The thought of losing her, of giving up what they had, was unbearable. But he couldn't ignore the threat. Someone was watching, waiting for him to slip. And the cost of being discovered could be more than either of them was prepared to pay. That night, as Elias sat alone in the workshop, the shadows seemed to press closer, the air thick with foreboding. He stared at the crumpled note on the table, his resolve hardening. But outside, in the moonlit street, a figure lingered in the shadows, their eyes fixed on the workshop door. The air in Raven's Hollow was heavy with tension, though most of the townsfolk were oblivious to its source. For Elias, every glance felt like a question, every shadow a warning. The note had unsettled him, but it didn't extinguish his resolve. If anything, it fanned the flames of his determination. Arya deserved to be free, and she deserved to be loved, not for her family name or her position in society, but for the person she was beneath all that. Elias couldn't walk away, no matter the cost. But the weight of the threat lingered in his every step. Arya, too, felt the invisible chains tightening around her. Her father's stern warnings about propriety and her future were becoming more frequent, his suspicions growing with each passing day. "You're distracted," he remarked one morning at breakfast, his sharp eyes narrowing at her. "And you've been far too restless lately." "It's unbecoming, Arya." "I've been reading, father," she lied, trying to keep her tone light. "Perhaps I've just lost myself in a story." Mayor Grayson's frown deepened. "Lose yourself in something more productive. I've had enough of this wandering nonsense. You're not a child anymore, and your future requires focus." He leaned back in his chair, his tone shifting to one of authority. "I've made arrangements for you to meet Maxwell Carrington. His family is respected, and a match with him will secure your place as a true Grayson." Arya's stomach dropped. Maxwell Carrington. The name alone conjured memories of a spoiled, arrogant boy she had once known, now grown into a man who seemed to embody the worst of Ravenshallow's elite. "I don't want to marry Maxwell," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her father's gaze turned icy. "You will do what is best for this family, Arya. That is your duty." Duty. The word echoed in her mind, sharp and bitter. That evening, Arya slipped away once more, her thoughts tangled and her heart racing. She found Elias waiting for her by the old oak tree near the chapel ruins. His expression softened as he saw her approach, but it quickly darkened when she recounted her father's plans. "Maxwell Carrington?" Elias scoffed. "That pompous idiot who treats people like property? He's worse than your father." Arya nodded, her frustration bubbling over. "I can't let this happen, Elias." "I won't. But what choice do I have? He'll never listen to me." Elias reached for her hands, his grip firm and steady. "We'll figure this out. Together. I promise you." His words calmed her, though doubts still lingered. "What about the note?" she asked, her voice low. "Do you know who sent it?" Elias shook his head, his jaw tightening.
No.
But someone knows about us, and they want to keep us apart. That's why we have to be careful. Careful, she repeated, a bitter edge to her voice. Careful won't stop my father from forcing me into a marriage I don't want. Elias hesitated, then spoke with quiet conviction. Meet me tomorrow night. The abandoned chapel just outside town. We'll talk more there, away from prying eyes. We'll find a way out of this, Arya. I swear it. Arya nodded, holding on to the fragile hope his words offered. The next day passed in a haze of tension. Arya played her part, attending tea with her father's acquaintances and feigning interest in trivial gossip. Inside, her mind churned, counting the hours until she could meet Elias again. Meanwhile, Elias worked at the family workshop, his hands carving intricate patterns into wood, though his thoughts were far from his craft. He kept the crumpled note in his pocket, a constant reminder of the danger surrounding them. As dusk fell, Elias prepared to leave for the chapel. But as he stepped out of the workshop, 2 guards blocked his path. Elias Mason, one of them barked. You're under arrest. Elias blinked, stunned. For what? Theft, the guard replied, his tone cold. A shipment of goods went missing from the mayor's warehouse, and your family's been implicated. That's ridiculous. Elias protested. We've done nothing. Before he could finish, the other guard grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. Save your excuses, the first guard growled. You can explain it to the mayor. Elias struggled, fury boiling in his veins. This was a setup, a calculated move to remove him from Arya's life. As the guards dragged him away, Elias' mind raced. He couldn't let this stop him. He had to get to the chapel. He had to warn Arya. Arya arrived at the chapel just as the last rays of sunlight faded. The crumbling stone walls and overgrown vines gave the place an air of melancholy, but she felt comforted by its solitude. She paced nervously, glancing toward the path Elias would take. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and still, there was no sign of him. Elias, she called softly, her voice echoing in the empty space. The chapel remained silent. A chill ran down her spine as she heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, approaching from the darkness. Her heart leapt, but the figure that emerged from the shadows wasn't Elias. It was Maxwell Carrington. Arya, he said smoothly, his smile thin and predatory. Your father told me you might be prone to sneaking off. Imagine my surprise when I found you here. Arya took a step back, her pulse quickening. What do you want, Maxwell? He chuckled, his tone dripping with condescension. I want what's best for you, of course. And sneaking around in the dead of night? Hardly befitting a future Carrington bride. I'm not marrying you, she said firmly, though her voice shook. Maxwell's smile vanished, replaced by a cold glare. You'll do as your father says. You don't have a choice, Arya. From outside the chapel, a distant shout echoed through the night, Elias' voice, filled with desperation. But before Arya could react, Maxwell stepped closer, his hand gripping her arm as his expression darkened. You don't need to worry about him, Maxwell said quietly. He won't be coming for you.